Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know it's been a very windy day. You've probably been blown in here. I'm really delighted that Ahmadullah Bhai invited me here to chair this evening's session. And I'm delighted to present Fatima Rajina, who will be talking about the journey of ethnicity and religiosity amongst the East End Bangladeshis, a comparison between two generations. So I think journey is a good way to describe identity, something that's constantly moving, constantly shifting. And as a British Bangladeshi Muslim myself, I know that I'm constantly navigating minimum 3 different cultures, if not more, plus certain hybrid cultures that are constantly developing. And I guess I just wanted to say a little bit about my journey to the Bricklaying Circle, the seminar series. I found out about it in 2008 when I was doing some research in East London, and I was looking at why British Bangladeshi girls were underrepresented in science, technology, engineering and maths. And as part of that study, we sort of interviewed girls in secondary schools across the borough, including their parents and teachers. And so part of that study, in trying to understand why they were underrepresented, was looking at their identity and looking at cultural change. And what was interesting, I suppose, it's going back quite a few years now, but one thing I remember is that the girls sort of saw their cultural change as quite diverse. Some of them identified Bangladesh as home, some of them didn't. They saw their lives as quite different from girls back at home. Some of them found they loved the Bangla language, some of them found it really difficult and didn't really identify with it. And they started seeing themselves identifying more with their Muslim culture. So amongst the girls, they talked about cultural change a lot, and that they certainly saw it as something changing, shifting. Whereas when you spoke to the parents and the teachers, they tended to have more fixed notions about what cultural identity was. I'm just looking at the aspirations of the girls. I mean, they range from anything to wanting to become a prime minister to feeling that why girls might be underrepresented in certain subjects was because they wore the hijab and they felt maybe the hijab prevented them from getting certain jobs in certain sectors. Whereas when you spoke to teachers if they were non-Bangladeshi sort of saw the girls perhaps having somewhat conservative sort of parents, slightly restricted in some ways. Whereas parents, when you spoke to them, they had huge aspirations for their children, as you might imagine, wanting them to become doctors, lawyers, teachers. But one thing that was perhaps noticeable is that they wanted the job for their daughters to be ladylike, if that makes any sense. So it was really interesting when I was looking at the programme for this week when Ahmadullah Bhai said, "Can you chair a session?" and I zoomed in on Fatima's session, and I thought it looked fascinating. And Fatima's a very interesting scholar herself. She's multi-talented, multilingual. She speaks Bengali, English, German, Spanish. She's a fully qualified German and Spanish teacher. She speaks Urdu. She's currently studying Arabic. She's in her 3rd year at SOAS. I'm a Nohud scholar. And this is funded by a Kuwaiti family, I believe, which is looking at how Muslims integrate in British society. So she's in her 3rd year, and she'll share with us some of her findings from her research. She has many other skills and talents. She's heavily involved in the Bangladeshi community. She's a radio show host for Better Bangla. And she's also won the Princess Diana Memorial Award for her work in promoting diversity and social cohesion. So I'll hand over to Fatima. She has about 14 minutes to do her presentation, and after that we'll have a Q&A. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions. If I could just ask you to switch off your mobile phones. And also bear in mind that as Fatima's presenting her findings, not all of them are necessarily her personal opinions. It is what the interviewees have opened up and told her about their experiences of identity. So if you could just bear that in the back of your mind.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, good evening. First of all, thank you to Ahmadullah Bhai for inviting me. It's my first time giving this presentation outside of a university setting, so I hope you'll be patient with me while I try to gather my words and thoughts. I just want to start off with a short story that I got from one of the individuals I interviewed. He's in his early 50s, and he went to Bangladesh this year with his daughter, and she's 15 years old. So when they got onto the Biman plane to make the journey to Dhaka, then they were going to take internal flight from Dhaka to domestic flight from Dhaka to Sylhet. So she got on the plane and she saw women who looked like Bengali women on the streets of East London. So they got on, they made their way to Bangladesh, they travelled around for 3 weeks, they got back into the plane, and the daughter looked at her dad and said, "Abba, these people on the plane don't look like the Bengalis we just saw in Bangladesh." So this is what I thought I would start the whole talk with, because I find it quite fascinating that a 15-year-old who is potentially a third or even fourth generation, well in that family it's fourth, that she managed to see this visual aesthetic difference between the Bengalis on the plane, how they were wearing the hijab, the jilbab, but whereas in Bangladesh, she saw women in the sari, in the salwar kameez, so she saw that dynamic, that difference, and mentioned it to her dad. In fact, her dad started off the whole interview with me with the story, which I thought was quite fascinating, just to see that there's this generation gap. But my personal interest in this topic began with personal interaction with Bengalis as a Bengali myself. But just to provide a bit of context of where I'm from, I'm not from East London myself, I'm from Luton. So that makes me an outsider in this research, despite being a Bengali. Because a lot of in my first year of your PhD, you have to go through like a mini viva, where you have to defend your thesis. So I had my 4 supervisors in front of me, and the 4 of them criticized me for being an insider. So how do we know you're being objective? How do we know you're being fair to the people you're researching, because they're your own people? But actually, the people I've interviewed were very open with me, especially when it came to the political opinions, because they don't know me. Well, some of them managed to trace my family when I told them where I'm from. But I think that's quite standard, especially the older generation I interviewed. The first question they did ask me before I pressed the record button, what's your dad's surname? Where's your village? Your body in Bangladesh. So I guess that's the older generation. This amazing skill they have of the networks, and a lot of them knew my granddad, who came to Britain in 1961, who actually landed here in East London, but then made his way to Vauxhall in Luton. So this is my background, and I took an interest in this because I found, as I will demonstrate in the talk, that a lot of academic research has focused on the Pakistani community here in Britain. And I believe that was the case, or is the case still today, because they make up the biggest Muslim population here in Britain. And there are a handful of researchers who look at British Bangladeshis. So I will cite some of those scholars as we go along to give you an indication of how many studies there have been in relation to the Pakistani community and the Bengali community. And what I find interesting about the Bengali community is, if you've kept up with the politics recently, with how Islam and the role of Islam is shifting across Britain, the one mosque that used to represent Britain, let's say about 15 years ago, was which one in London? Which mosque represented Islam globally? Regent's Park Mosque was the mosque that everyone thought of when they thought of Britain, Islam, Muslims. But now it's no longer Regent's Park Mosque, it's East London Mosque. And East London Mosque is pretty, studying at SOAS, I did my master's at SOAS as well. And a lot of international Muslim students I met, they wanted to feel Islam in Britain, and they'd always say, I'm going to go to East London Mosque to get that feeling. So it was really interesting, just from speaking to non-South Asian international students coming to Britain, that East London Mosque was something they had heard of before they even landed in Britain, and that was a mosque they wanted to go to go to Jummah, to experience and see what British Muslim or Islam is and is becoming. So religious ethnic identity, I chose this title. It's still a working title for my thesis. I haven't decided if I want to keep that for my final piece or shuffle it. Maybe you can help me. But I chose ethno-religious identity because ethnicity, well, again, we'd have to go back to history. One of the reasons why Bangladesh came into existence was the emphasis on what? On the language. So the language is the key marker to define a Bengali. Whereas when Pakistan came into existence, though Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan, what did it use to come into existence? It used what? Religion. So it used Islam. So Pakistan had to come into existence through Islam. So if today, for example, I mean, it would never happen, but if they were to dismantle Pakistan and make it, forge it back to India, there's not that, I mean, if you look at the work of Faisal Devji, he makes a contrast between Israel, the creation of Israel, and the creation of Pakistan. And he says that Pakistan didn't have a justification other than Islam to come into existence, because it doesn't have a historical relationship with that land, so to say. So Pakistan already took religion, and then Bangladesh heavily relied on its language and therefore on its ethnicity to create its own nation state, which came into existence in 1971. And what is interesting about Bangladesh is also politically, it didn't rely on Islam. So not just identity, but politically, what did it rely on?
Sorry?
What did Bangladesh rely on politically to create itself as a nation state?
Economic inequality.
So think of Pakistan using religion as a form of identity as well as politics. Secularism. Bangladesh had to rely on secularism. Otherwise, Bangladesh's existence, separating from West Pakistan, wouldn't have made sense. You know, because if it had held on to Islam, well, why do you want to separate from West Pakistan? So language was used, and of course, secularism was used as a way to distinguish itself from Pakistan, which is the case with identity in general. You have to always have an other to define yourself, which I will go into much later. So to start off with, right. So why this community? I briefly explained some of the reasons, this community, and another great example my second supervisor gave me was during partition. When you think of partition of India, what's the first thing you think of? Partition of India, when it happened in 47.
Right.
You think of riots, but which side do you think of? Punjab. Everyone always goes to Punjab first. So again, I found that quite interesting, that I thought I'm going to use that as a theory to relate it to the British context, that even in partition, we never really think of the Bengal. We forget that the Bengal was also partitioned. We always think of the Punjab because of the political, tension between India and Pakistan. So I guess there are more scholars and more researchers. So Bengal is left out of this. So the first thing I wanted to look at was identity, and what does identity mean? So in anthropological discourse, identity means being the same as oneself as well as being different. And according to the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, there is no clear concept of identity in modern sociology. But to go back to, before I further delve into the topic of identity, I wanted to look at, just give you a brief outline of the literature that exists on Muslims. So not just Bangladeshis, but Muslims. So the literature on Muslims in Britain covers the history of Muslim immigrants from the 19th century. So one of the key scholars on this is Humayun Ansari, who's based at Royal Holloway. He looks at the migration of Muslims going as far back as 16th century. So when they came as part of the Bengal, a lot of the Muslims would come over, go back. Then he looks at the Lashkars, he looks at the pre-World War I migration, then the migration of Bengalis, as well as other Muslims between the two wars, and then post-World War II period that I guess majority of us are more familiar with than the previous migration patterns. Now, the ethnographic studies, as I mentioned, have been on Pakistani Muslims in Britain, have been carried out by people like Saeed. In 1999, he conducted a study on Glasgow Pakistani teenagers and the role of national and ethnic identity. Jacobson, in 1998, researched ethno-religious identity of British Pakistani Muslims in Bradford. And the only study from the 80s that I found on Bengalis was by a gentleman called, I don't have his first name here, just his surname, Barton, in 1986, did a research where he looked at the Bangladeshi community in Bradford and the role of the mosque and imam in the daily lives of the Bangladeshis in that area. So, looking at Bengalis and Islam, the overwhelming majority of Bangladeshis in Britain are Muslim, with 92% identifying themselves as Muslims in the 2001 census. I have to admit, I haven't quite got round to the 2011 census. I've broken it down yet for myself. So a lot of the statistics I cite here are from the 2001 census. So they're not up to date. I do apologise for that, but I'm currently working on it. So Bangladeshi Muslims account for nearly 17% of Britain's Muslim population, the second largest after Pakistanis. Bangladeshi Muslims are Sunnis, allied to the syncretic Barelvi tradition, which emphasises the role of customs, shrines and peers. Does everyone understand the term peer here? P-I-R? Peer tends to be the equivalent of a guru. The equivalent of a guru you go to for religious guidance, spiritual guidance, and who advise. I mean, almost like a priest in the Catholic Church. When you go make confession, though of course we don't have confession as a ritual, as a custom, but that's the role of the peer.
But you can be dead peer in.
Yes, you can also be a dead peer. People go to their shrines and seek their blessing.
Something like mysticism.
Sorry?
Mysticism,
yeah. So a lot of Sufism, but I'm going to get onto that when I get into religious identity. I'm going to discuss the role of Sufism amongst Bangladeshis. The Bangladeshis are among the most homogeneous, with nearly all of them originating from Sylhet, which is east of Bangladesh. The vast majority are from that region. Now, religious and ethnic identities are shaped by religious and cultural values and practices. The cultural elements do not solely include religion, dress, practices, and organizational affiliations, but also nationality, tradition, morality, language, and shared, observable social norms and values, material culture, and cuisine. Now, for example, Eid in 2003 carried out research among second-generation Arab-Canadian Christians and Muslim college students, and found that religion served as an ethnic-like identity marker for this group of people. For example, he found that a lot of the Christians, they would like to go back to, especially the Lebanese Christians, they would always go back to what is the ancient civilization of Lebanon? Starts with P.
Phoenicia.
Yes, that's it. They always go back to Phoenicia as a way to assert their identity, whereas Lebanese Arab Muslims didn't do that. They just relied on, if they were Shia, they would specify their Shia-ness. If they were Sunni, they would assert that. So it varied, but it was just interesting that the Lebanese Canadian Christians, Arab Christians, identified with being Phoenician, though of course we know no such nation state exists. Though, does that mean there has to be a nation state for you to feel affiliated with that? Because we have the Kurdish community as an example for that. So identity, as I mentioned, means being the same as oneself as well as being different. So it is widely and loosely used in reference to one's sense of self and one's feeling and ideas about oneself. It is sometimes assumed that our identity comes from the expectations attached to the social roles that we occupy and which we then internalize, so that is formed through the process of socialization. Alternatively, it is elsewhere assumed that we construct our identities more actively out of the materials presented to us during socialization or in our various roles. Now, I have a perfect example for this. Last year I was teaching in a school here in East London, and naturally a majority of the pupils in that school were Bengali. And in the Bengali class there was one English boy in the class. There were year 8 or year 9 pupils, and he spoke almost perfect Sylheti. I mean, I just thought it was fascinating, and again his identity was being shaped by the fact that all his friends were Bengali and he spoke Bengali. I mean, if you close your eyes, you would think he was speaking to a brown-looking Bengali from Sylhet. So I thought that's really interesting, that it's through the process of socialization we then determine how we are, who we are, how we want to assert ourselves. But I don't want to focus too much on identity. I want to move on to other parts related to to identity. So Britishness, how do we define Britishness? Anyone want to attempt defining it for me?
Fish and chips.
Fish and chips, okay. Anything else?
Something to do with tea, probably.
Okay, tea. Anything else?
Okay. play.
Fair play.
Friday night.
Friday nights.
Queuing.
Queuing. Queuing. Okay. Anything else?
Tikka masala.
Tikka masala. So yeah, those things are Britishness. That's how. Well, I mean, a lot of academics that I've cited in my own research have used pretty much everything you've said as a way to define Britishness. So, and what is interesting when you look at Britishness compared to Englishness is that, especially a lot of people I interviewed, the vast majority accepted that they would refer to themselves as British, but never English, because they view English as they say, WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So they would never refer to themselves as English. British, because why do you think a lot of these participants were okay with British but not English? Why British though? How many of you would call yourself British? And English? Okay, why British?
It's more all-encompassing.
Yep, that was one of the first responses I got.
British with hyphen.
The hyphen.
Hyphenated British.
Hyphenated British. Okay, so those were the reasons given, that Britishness is a lot more inclusive. But again, a lot of research that was carried out in Scotland and Wales found that they don't actually, the Muslims who grew up in Scotland and Wales do not refer to themselves as British. They use Scottish or Welsh. So what was interesting with the referendum in Scotland was that one of the key people who was leading it in the SNP was Hamza Yusuf, one of the Pakistani Scottish politician, and he also referred to himself as Scottish quite openly in a lot of his speeches, and they're very, very comfortable. They wouldn't, because the Scottish and the Welsh view Britishness with Englishness, but the Muslims in England don't do so, because they view Englishness as an ethnic identity where you have to be white, you have to be Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. So that's Britishness, and the whole term Britishness became a state policy during the late 90s. After the 7/7 attacks. But before that, it was more multiculturalism. Multiculturalism became state policy in the late 90s, leading up to the attacks in 7/7. And then Tony Blair decided that this is what defines Britishness. Standing up for our country means standing up for the core British values of fair play, creativity, tolerance, and an outward-looking approach to the world. And then, of course, after 2005, we started noticing the English language tests, which weren't there prior to the attacks. And the proficiency in English is, in fact, understood to be a marker of Britishness. And if you have a slight accent, there was an article just about 3 days ago about when you speak with accents. I don't know if you saw it. One of the ministers said you shouldn't shy away from applying for jobs if you have a strong Geordie or whatever accent you have. Don't shy away from it. Don't try to make it too southern. But it's really interesting that even your Englishness, the way you speak English and the accent you use also determines how British you are, because then you have the regional differences that come in. And then now Britishness, one of the reasons I put National Front there, a lot of the people I interviewed who grew up in the 70s and 80s here in East London, they never felt safe calling themselves British during that time. And one of the reasons is because of the National Front, who used to hold their stall at the end of Brick Lane. And a lot of them just simply felt alienated, marginalised, and that they simply weren't wanted. And it really kicked off with the killing of Al-Tabali outside the park, or near to the park. That's when Bengalis decided to mobilise, and they didn't trust the police either, because they saw them as part of the British establishment, which we are not a part of. So in the 80s, there was the anti-racist movement, and what was fascinating was that during that period, there was a lot of collaboration with the anti-racist movement in Brixton and in other parts of in parts of Hackney. So a lot of the Caribbean community actually came together with the Bengali communities to fight the National Front off the streets. Moving on to ethnic identity, so my specific focus is on dress and language. Although there are other variables, but I wanted to reduce it to two things. In fact, my supervisor made me. And relying on language and dress. So I chose language because, as I mentioned, being Bengali is defined by the language. And it's also related to religion, because Arabic has become a vital language in understanding your religion. Dress, interesting, because again, in my own family, and a lot of people that have confirmed this that I've interviewed, that a lot of their mothers would wear saris in the 70s and 80s and the long coats, those big baggy long coats. And then in the 90s, they saw a shift where a lot of mothers, married women, were wearing salwar kameez. Now that's interesting because, I mean, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the salwar kameez defined you as a girl. You were the girl who wasn't married yet. And you made the transition into a sari once you got married. So for a lot of people in the 90s, seeing married women and with children wearing salwar kameez was a bit of a shock to a lot of people. So I thought dress is quite interesting, and of course now we see that there's no salwar kameez, there's no sari, but there's jilbab, burqas, and especially the niqab, which a lot of people I've interviewed find very, they used words such as strange, alien, because the niqab hasn't, a lot of the older generation said it's not something they grew up seeing. It's not something they grew up seeing on the streets of London or in Bangladesh. So it's something very unusual for the older generation. Whereas the younger generation just see it as part and parcel of walking down the street of Whitechapel or Brick Lane. And of course, I also asked the question, how do Bengalis feel Asian? Because here in the British context, you have the additional label of being Asian. Not only are you Bangladeshi, not only are you British, you're also Asian. And again, a lot of Bengalis I interviewed, the majority don't like the term Asian because they felt that was something that was sort of imposed on them, thrown onto them. So a lot of them rejected it, but they do, when they fill out the form, they tick Asian, British Asian. And then does religion play a role in constructing an ethnic identity? That varied depending on who I was interviewing. The older generation didn't see a clash between the ethnicity and religious identity. The younger generation did, and I will give you examples once I move on. Now, I look at the language and I look at dress. Dress is important because, again, dress is perceived by my generation that I interviewed as something that's not Bengali. So a lot of Bengali women I interviewed don't view the sari as a Bengali dress. Okay? They view it as something that's been taken from the Indians. So when I asked them, what do you mean Indians? So it was taken from the Hindus. So it's a Hindu dress, it's not our dress. And when you asked about shalwar kameez, some of them said, well, it's a Pakistani dress, we took it from them. So we don't really have anything. So that was how a lot of people felt towards dress. The men didn't, a lot of men that I interviewed had a problem with the sari because it shows too much of your back and shows too much of your side. So that's what the men had a problem with, but the women just didn't see it as part of being Bengali. Not all of them, some of them. When it came to language, again, very few of them studied Bengali. Just the older generation, they can still read and write Bengali and read the newspapers. But the younger generation, I don't think I interviewed a single person who can read or write Bangla. Because they were just that was never a priority for them.
What are the age groups?
So age groups, okay. Age groups, I interviewed previous generation, they're all aged between 45 and 60. And my generation, they're aged between 20 and 35. Yeah. Well, not even 35. A lot of I interviewed a 31-year-old. I don't think anyone was older than 31. So 20 to 31 and then 45 to 60 was what I was looking at.
So if they didn't identify with the sari and they didn't identify...
They identified with the religious attire, with the jilbab,
just
the jilbab and the hijab. So that's what they fell back on. Religious identity, so I try to look at the significance of religion in the lives of the participants, the relationship with the Islamic dress code and the Arabic language, how the participants express their commitment to religion and what do they gain from it. And then of course I asked them the famous question, living as a Muslim in Britain, does it act as a force of identity? Now what was interesting about especially the Arabic language was that, so I interviewed two men who are both of them in their, one in their late 30s, the other one early 40s. Both of them said to me they speak to the children in Arabic. So they lived in the Middle East, both Bengali men, their wives are Bengali, and so their wives speak to the children in English, and the husbands speak to the children in Arabic. So there's no Bengali whatsoever. And so one of the questions I asked, and one father is a barrister and an Islamic scholar, and the other one is an academic. And both of them said, well, Bengali doesn't have a function in our lives. So I asked, well, do you not feel you're taking away the heritage of your children? And they said, no, not really, because then they have Islam. So that's how they viewed, that's the importance that was given to the Arabic language, that is what will get my children through life. That is what they need. They don't need Bengali. So, and it was interesting that both the parents are Bengali, mother speaks English, father speaks Arabic, and the parents, when they speak to each other in front of the children, they speak English. So no Bengali whatsoever, but they were the only two people. Everyone else I interviewed do speak Bengali. The older generation, of course, speak it much better, because I did speak to a lot of the younger generation in Bengali. And a few of them, about 3 of them, did half their interviews in Bengali with me in their 20s. So I was quite impressed, because I thought I would be getting the older generation doing the interviews in Bengali. Now, the story of Shah Jalal is something a lot of people will bring up. Anyone know Shah Jalal? Yeah? Shah Jalal was one of the people who came from Yemen. Well, actually, there's apparently new research saying he was possibly Kenyan. Kenyan, yeah.
He's Yemeni?
Yemeni is the story that every Bengali has heard. But I recently met a Bengali academic from Cardiff University, and he told me that Shah Jalal, he's found documents proving that he's from Kenya. Now, I don't know, I've not done research on this, but I just think it's interesting because every Bengali I know always says Yemen. So he arrived with his, was it 360 or 345? 360 awliyas to Bangladesh. I believe it was 12th or 13th century to fight against the Hindu king who was oppressing the Muslims. So that's a story a lot of people brought up, and the first story they heard of Islam in Bangladesh and Sylhet. And if you speak to any Sylheti, they speak about going to Bangladesh and going to visit the shrine of Shah Jalal. And has anyone here been to the shrine of Shah Jalal? Yeah? When you walked into Shah Jalal, what did you take with you? Did you take anything with you? You take coins?
Yeah, special fish.
You have the fish thing. As a ritual, what do you take in?
Candles.
Candles?
And sweets, you know, the shinni.
Yeah, you take a lot of shinni and so if you go back to, we have to go back to looking at how Islam developed in South Asia, because you'd find that when Hindus go to the mandir, to the temple, they would take a basket with fruits and vegetables as a gift to the gods. And a lot of Muslims, especially through the Chishti, Sufi Tariqa and the Naqshbandis, they started adopting this. So even if you go to India to visit Moinuddin Chishti's dargah, or in fact any of them, you see people walking in with fruits and vegetables and going in. And that was something people brought up saying, well, that's haram, because that's what Hindus do. So a lot of the younger generation shunned this practice, saying we should stop doing this. You know, and I mean, a handful of them even said we should stop visiting the shrine because it's not permissible. We shouldn't be seeking blessings from peers, from Sufi saints. So there was mixed reaction, and again, it was the younger generation who were reluctant to visit such a shrine and give any importance to the rituals, whereas the older generation have fond memories of visiting it with their parents and taking their own children to Shah Jalal. Now, I look at dress, the role of the thobe.
There was this romantic story about Shah Jalal and his uncle giving him some red soil to plant something in. Wherever he finds that similar soil, it should scroll him having that place. And that happened to be in Sylhet.
Yeah.
I don't know how authentic the story is, but it's quite a romantic story about
I don't really focus much on the history of Shah Jalal's arrival and then the dispersal of the awliyas. I don't really look at that. I just look at how the influence of Shah Jalal amongst the people I interviewed, rather than the history of Shah Jalal's arrival itself. But of course I know that they all scattered the awliyas and they have dargahs across the whole of Bangladesh.
No, I'm just saying why specifically chose Sylhet to settle. It's to do with that romantic story of having that soil, red soil,
Yeah.
wherever they can find similar soil, they should sow that seed in that area.
Okay. I've never heard of that.
So my friend's doing research on Sharjah last
Yeah.
night.
That's very cool.
There's only one eyewitness account of Shah Jalal.
I think it was Ibn Battuta who mentioned in his diary collection that he visited the shrine or visited him. Or
Not shrine, he was still alive then.
He was still alive. Yeah, 12th century, 13th century.
Yeah,
One of
13th
those.
Yes.
So
No, 14th century. I
14th
think.
century. Okay, well I got the century. So dress was really interesting. Even visually, I spent a lot of time. One of the methods I use is participant observation. So I'm one of those creeps who sits in cafes, watches people. Especially if you're Bengali, I've been watching you. So I've just been observing how a lot of people, how they dress and how they express themselves. And you definitely see a lot of Bengalis wearing the jilbab, the middle picture, of a lot of them in the hijab. And quite a significant portion now you see in the niqab. And I did interview, I interviewed one woman in the niqab. I interviewed about 16 women. Out of the 16 women, that's another interesting thing, the gender balance. I interviewed 30 men and 16 women. Even though I got in touch with the same amount of women, but the women didn't talk to me. So I'm still trying to chase the women. But so that's what I've noticed, this trend. And even the wearing of the thobe. People I interviewed who used to go to Fora, or who used to go to their Islamic education after school, 5 to 7, a lot of them said, was when they used to have to go to mosque, that they would just wear a Punjabi, what a lot of Bengali men wear when they go to prayers, or they would wear just jeans and a long t-shirt and they turn up. And they carry a topi with them in their pockets and then put it on before they enter. And the girls would wear a shalwar kameez and then quickly put the scarf. But the younger generation, they mentioned no, not the younger generation, sorry. That generation especially those who are in their 30s that I interviewed, 30, 31, they have children now who are required to wear the thobe when they go to mosque, the white thobe, as well as the topi, and the girls have to wear black jilbab, black hijab. So you see this, but a lot of people say that 20 years ago that was not the case. You could wear the salwar kameez, any colour, and turn up. Same with the boys; they could wear a Punjabi or anything else that made so they were fully covered and turn up. Now I'm conscious of time. I've only got 10 minutes left. So one of the themes that I found amongst while I was interviewing a lot of the Bengalis is that the Hindus was used as a scapegoat for a lot of things. So, for example, the practice of Gaya Hulud. Does everyone know what the Gaya Hulud is? So the Gaya Hulud, would you like to tell us?
No. There's a yellow.
Yeah.
People sort of put yellow people in.
Yeah.
They used to do it in the 80s or 90s. And they stopped doing that for a long
But then
time.
they stopped, yeah. So the Gaya Hulud is a practice that is done depending on your family and how they do it. It's usually done the day before your henna. So they mix like turmeric powder with lime juice and various oils and they put it on the bride's body. And again, the Gaya Hulud, a lot of people I interviewed said, well, it's a Hindu practice. Why should we continue doing it? So a lot of the women, married women and men I interviewed, none of them had the Gaya Hulud. None of them, not a single one of them had a Gaya Hulud because they all believed, even though all of them had different religious convictions, if you want to say, practices, but Gaya Hulud was almost, there was a consensus that it's haram. It's not something we should do, it comes from the Hindus. Second thing, as I've already mentioned, was the sari. The sari was, again, seen as a Hindu attire, so we shouldn't wear it. Religious practices, so touching feet as a form of greeting, a lot of Bengalis used to do that. I'm sure a lot of families still do. So the younger lot in the family are required to give their salams to the old senior members of their family by touching the feet. Some families do it by touching it 3 times, some do it by touching it once. But that was something a lot of people dismissed as, again, it's a Hindu practice. Hindus do that when they enter their temple, when they want blessing from their gods, so they touch the feet, so why should we do it? And wearing of the red bindi, so the round red bindi, which is historically from the Bengal, the wearing of the red bindi, is also seen as, again, a Hindu thing, you shouldn't do it. I mean, I've got various other things, but I don't want to go into that now. So conclusion that I want to show, another thing, another aspect of identity I'll look at is ummah. Because a lot of people I've interviewed, when they talk about their Muslimness and religiosity, they associate it with the ummah. Does everyone understand what the term ummah is? So the global community of Muslims. Now when I ask them, where is the ummah for you? So for a lot of people it was in the Middle East, so it excluded South Asia. For others it was just, well, wherever there are Muslims, that's the ummah. Very few mentioned the ummah as being humanity itself, which incorporates everyone, non-Muslim, Muslim, living together. Now, ummah was used...
Micro and macro.
Yeah, the micro-macro argument. Do you mean, like in Britain, micro...
Well, I see as it two divisions, micro and macro.
Well, again, it depended on whom I interviewed.
I looked at the community and the global Muslim.
Yeah. Well, it varied with the people I interviewed. Again, with the younger generation, they had a lot more passion for Middle East politics, for example, because they associated Middle East politics with the Ummah. Whereas issues going on, so for example, I asked people about the Shabab movement that kicked off in Bangladesh, because it was happening in my first year of my PhD, the movement, and then the hanging of Mullah...
Karim Mullah.
Yeah. So I asked people about that. I asked people about how they feel about the trials going on in Bangladesh for the war trials, and a lot of them just said, they don't understand politics. They do need. A lot of people openly told me they believe Bangladesh doesn't understand politics. Few people said they don't understand politics because it's run by two women. So the argument was used that women aren't capable of politically managing a country. But a lot of the people I interviewed were heavily involved with the recent war in Gaza, raising money for Gaza, raising money for Syria. I mean, a lot of the people I interviewed, they're active members here in East London who organise various events across the East London, raising money. I mean, one of them, he was washing cars. He got a few of his friends together washing cars to raise money for Gaza and Syria, but they wouldn't do that for Bangladesh. He said it. He said, I don't see why I need to do that for Bangladesh. I need to give money to Bangladesh. So it was really interesting how the concept of ummah was defined through the Middle East, not through, for example, I mean, not through the traditional way of looking at ummah was always from Morocco all the way to Indonesia. But a lot of people restricted it to the Middle East. So the conclusion that I want to, I mean, I haven't drawn any conclusions yet myself because I'm still analysing a lot of the data and I'm still collecting. So if any of you are interested in being interviewed, do let me know, do get in touch. So the conclusion that I've come up with, or I've found from interviewing people, is that the younger generation are definitely holding on to Islam more than their Bengali identity. They're not concerned about Bangladesh politics. They're not concerned about speaking Bengali. That's the general overview. Though there was a few in that crowd who were concerned that people were dismissing their Bengali identity, their Bengaliness. The older generation, they are worried for the younger generation because they feel that they lack coping mechanism. So the older generation that I interviewed were people who are part of the anti-racist movement, who were also in Britain while Bangladesh became independent. So they were heavily politicized, if you want to say, but not in the same sense as the younger generation with politics related to, what's the word? The politics related to Islam and the identity politics. So the older generation feel a lot more comfortable with their religiosity and their ethnicity. They see no conflict between the two, and they're quite comfortable calling themselves British as well. And but a lot of them went back to coping mechanisms, saying the younger generation don't know how to deal with racism. They're too emotional. They don't know how to deal with Islamophobia, and a lot of them just said, boys. Especially boys have a lot of issues with trying to deal with their macho-ness because they're trying to seek or find a remedy through Islam to try and maintain their manliness, because the older generation relate it back to the boys' performance in schools, because the girls are outdoing the boys in school, whereas the girls are still somehow, if you want to say, policed by the family, whereas the boys, that's not the case, but the older generation fear that falling into the trap of political Islam, that they lose themselves, so they're not able to cope. So these are sort of the two conclusions, I'd say, my tentative conclusions for now. I mean, and also during this whole research, I became fascinated with buildings across East London. I've just collected a few pictures that I wanted to share with you. One guy I interviewed was kind enough to give me a whole tour of East London. He spent about 5 hours with me and telling me about the history of Bengalis arriving. Now, does anyone recognise this wash house on Old Castle Street near Metropolitan University? You are shaking your head. You know? Or what is this place?
It used to be a public bath.
Public bath, yeah, because a lot of East London houses didn't have bathrooms.
Yes.
So a lot of Bengalis, I interviewed their fathers who came in the 50s and as Lashkars came and used the wash houses. There's one in Euston that you'll find behind Euston Station, though it's not marked as a wash house. I believe this is the only one that's been kept intact, that Bengalis use. This building here of Petticoat Lane Market was the first building where a lot of Bengali men started staying when they first started arriving post World War II migration. And another thing that I became fascinated with is the relationship between Bengalis and the Jewish community. A lot of people I interviewed, especially those in their 40s and 50s, have clear memories of walking into kosher butchers and buying kosher meat, eating kosher meat. One lady I interviewed 2 weeks ago, she just said to me, it wasn't remarkable. I mean, they were Jewish, we were Bengalis, there was nothing exciting about it. It was just an ordinary thing. We saw an Orthodox Jewish man. But of course, with the climate in the Middle East, it's nice to know that people were able to live together.
The other thing is you don't get kosher meat shop many around here. You have a lot of halal meat shop now.
Yeah. So
those days you didn't have any choice.
Yeah, they didn't have a choice. Yeah, but they use religion again here to accommodate their dietary needs. So CHN Katz is one of the oldest signs left of a Jewish company on Brick Lane. If you walk halfway through Brick Lane, you will see that sign. Ecro Fabrics is the only business running on Brick Lane by a Jewish family. So when you walk in, they're Orthodox Jews, so you'll see them wearing the yarmulke. Now, this picture you can't really see, but the pipeline there, if you ever walk past the school, the pipeline there has a Star of David on it. And it was a Catholic school, and then when the French Huguenots started arriving, when they were fleeing persecution by the Catholics, they arrived, they were also attending the school. They put the Star of David on there to let the Jewish community know that they're also welcome. But of course now, 95% of the children attending are Bengalis.
What about 70? It's less than that now.
Less than that now?
Yeah, it's changing quite quickly.
Okay. This sign there, if you look at Brick Lane Jami Mosque, on Brick Lane, it says Umbra Sumus, which means we are shadows in Latin. And I took this quote from Salam Brick Lane by Tartan Hall. And this building again was fascinating because again it was a French Huguenots who used it as a church, then it became a synagogue, and today it's a mosque. And again, the whole Umbra Sumus, as he says, it's we are shadows, and it's a proven a fitting motto, not just for the French, but for all the immigrants who have settled here. So I think this applies to a lot of the people that I interviewed who are moving out of East London and are moving to zone 3 and 4, so to places like Gans Hill, Redbridge. One lady I interviewed, a lot of people started talking about gentrification as well, though I didn't cover it here. But one family I interviewed, they have a 3-bedroom house off Brick Lane, and they bought the property and they decided to move out because they felt the area was no longer the area it was for the children to grow up in. So they bought a house in Redbridge, and they got an agent to come to the house to value the whole property. And they thought it was just going to be £3,000. And the agent came and said, well, your living room's massive, convert it into 2 bedrooms, forget having a living room, and you can get £5,000 out of this. And I interviewed a lot of people who are doing this because they know that people, or they refer to as hipsters, coming and willing to pay that amount. So a lot of Bengalis are moving out because they're seeing this as an investment for their children's future. But again, this one woman who moved out of Brick Lane now with the 3-bedroom house, but now possibly 5-bedroom, she mentioned how her father has to come back to East London every day. He comes back on the train, on the Central Line, he comes back every day because these are the roads he's familiar with. These are the roads he wants to be in, he wants to live in, but I guess circumstances don't allow it. But a few other people I interviewed, their families have moved back. They're back in Aldgate East, Whitechapel regularly because these are the streets they're familiar with. Again, the Rinkoff's Cafe is just on Balance Road, one of the few Jewish cafes left. And I wanted to end it on this, the street names in Bengali. London is the only place in the world, apart from the Bengal, that has names in Bengali and has a Bangla town. Which we always think of, when we think of a town associated with an ethnicity, we always think of Chinatown. So Brick Lane and this whole area is quite unique in the world for Bengalis because of this. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, that was absolutely fascinating. I'd like to open the floor now to questions, but before I do, I feel like Fatima's kind of given us the East London tour as well that Georgie Wemyss is doing on Saturday. I just wanted to ask a question about your methodology, and I was really intrigued that you said that women were more reluctant to speak to you. Why do you think that is?
A lot of them just had other priorities. They have families, so a lot of them work, so then after work they have to pick up children.
Is this what you consider the older generation or the younger generation?
Well, the younger generation, because I wanted to get 10, okay, so I wanted to get 20 from each generation and then dividing it into both genders.
Okay.
But with my generation, I've already got enough. With the older generation, I only have 4 women I've interviewed. So a lot of the information I've shared with you about the older generation, especially the women, has been just from these 4 women. Because, I even offered to, I'm happy to do the interviews in Bengali, and I even said to the women, if you feel, you're uncomfortable speaking in English, I offered, but I don't know, maybe they were reluctant, maybe because people have certain stereotypes when you're a researcher, when you go in, that you may abuse what they share with you. I don't know. Although that could have come from the men as well, but I really don't have an answer for you. A lot of the women just responded saying, we're busy, we have families.
Okay, and just a little bit more about your methodology and perhaps going forward how maybe people in this room might be able to support you.
So methodology I used, sorry, I'm just trying to get the methodology. Methodology I used semi-structured interviews. But it varied. The older generation that I interviewed, it turned into oral history. It turned into an oral history project, without a doubt. Because the older generation, their interviews, the shortest interview was 2.5 hours, the longest was 4.5 hours. The younger generation, my shortest interview is 46 minutes, and the longest is 1 hour, 20 minutes. So I think that itself indicates what they had to say. And with the older generation, when I asked them one question, I literally got a 15-20 minute response. But that's a great thing for me. It means I have rich data, I have a lot to look at and analyze. Whereas with the younger generation, it felt like almost like a job interview. So I asked them the question in front of me, they responded, they waited for the next question. Whereas with the older generation, because they were navigating through their own memory of things that happened to them, things they recalled, I felt like I had to ask them additional questions to the ones that I already had prepared. So the older generation took me by surprise, and I did definitely enjoy talking to the older generation because they just opened up a whole different realm for me anyway, because there was so much I was learning. But younger generation was definitely just interview. I met up with them, I asked the question, they responded, nothing more to it. So the older generation is definitely oral history, which I wasn't expecting. So that's something I have to look into because I don't know the theoretical side of oral history.
So we've just less than an hour, I think, for Q&A. Would you like to take one question at a time or cluster them together?
One at
Yeah. Okay. So if you could raise your hands for questions, and I'll take one at a time. And if you could try and keep it brief and keep it to a question, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
I don't mind.
I'll start with you. I think
I actually have a methodology question for you because I'm also a researcher on Bangladeshi cuisine. I was just wondering how long your research, what time span did you take to get all these interviews together?
I started last year mid-November, so I'm still doing interviews, and I'll be finishing mid-November. I'm in my third year, so because I'm on a scholarship as well, I have deadlines set by the donors, which is a good thing because it means I get the work done. But it's also an additional stress. So from what I know, from the anthropology department in SOAS, we're required to do it 1 year, especially because I have 2 anthropologists on my committee, supervisory committee. So so 1 year, and I collected, as I said, 46 interviews, 16 women, 30 men. But I'm still looking to interview. But another thing that I did, as I mentioned, participant observation, where I sit in cafes and watch people. I did semi-structured interviews with it became oral history as well. And I also became a participant. So I was also observing how I was with people. Because I know when I have my final or viva, that is what I'm going to be attacked on, that I'm an insider. But what I've learned from this 1 year of collecting data is that though a lot of Bengalis, of course, I mean, a lot of them openly said to me, if you were not Bengali, we would have never, ever shared a lot of the things we have with you. But then the disadvantage is that, when I have my viva, I'll be seen as, an insider who's too familiar with her subjects. That's the common argument used. So yeah, it has advantages, disadvantages. So those are the things that I've considered in my methodology. The semi-structured interviews is what I relied on, what I walked in with. Participant observation and a participant myself because of my insider status.
Great.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question. Maybe it's premature because you haven't finished your research and you haven't drawn your conclusions. Yeah, conclusions is yeah. But I want to ask a question anyone. When I grew up in Tower Hamlets, this was in the 80s, 90s, I was very active in the anti-racist movement that you talked about, and gradually getting into local politics and sort of community politics as well. At that time, when we were campaigning for equal rights, equal access to higher education and so on, one of the response from our older generation was they were not very keen on higher education, especially for their girls, because they saw this as a way of losing them from the community, from the family. They will get westernized, they will give up their religion, culture, and so on. But experience shows, in the last 20 so years, that hasn't happened. If anything, they have become more attached to religion, not so much language and ethnicity. And that's, I think, is a good thing because it's proved that all the sociologists and race relation academics who are predicting this is gone haywire. I wonder what your understanding is why that has happened. How? What were the forces that was influencing this? And also, why the younger generation now identifying with Islam and Britishness and so on, but they put their religious identity before everything else. We, our generation and our parents' generation, they, like Debbie said in her opening, we do recognize that there are multiple identities. And
last year. And my experience was that this school has a sixth form as well. And my experience with parents, Bengali parents evenings, was that a lot of the parents are still concerned to send their daughters to sixth form. That's still a concern because they're worried that they're going to be exposed to a lot of things they shouldn't be. We had cases of, we had a year 10 pupil who was closely monitored by her father when she went out of school, came to school. So there was a lot of, we had a lot of issues with parents with, when they came to their daughters. So this is just anecdotal sort of experience, but otherwise I can't respond to that question, why the shift in education. I'll hand that over to
It's been a long time since I did my research, and so we didn't really kind of interview those things. I mean, like, I remember when we interviewed the parents, they were keen for their daughters to study, but I think in East London, one thing I noticed is they didn't want their daughters to go too far. So I think it goes back to your point of keeping an eye on your daughters. You don't want them too exposed. So what the girls would talk about was their marriage CV, and they were very conscious, even at a very young age, of what should go on their marriage CV. So often the girls were aged 15, 16. So a degree looked great on your marriage CV because the other family could say, oh, she's a lawyer. But it wasn't necessarily for anything, to actually utilise that degree per se, but just to sort of say, wow, she's a lawyer and therefore she's kind of qualified, if you like, to marry into a good family. But not really to do. I don't think they had really thought much beyond that, to be honest. But like I said, it's a long time ago. But I'm sure.
But your second question was, why are they choosing Islam? Islam is comfortable. Islam is comfortable because it gives you guidelines that a lot of the young generation don't find in the Bengali tradition. Because they find that their own parents have a habit of picking and choosing when they want to use religion, when they want to use culture. So they see that as a form of hypocrisy from their parents. So what they try to do is they try to refine Islam themselves from their own understanding and going to various talks organised by various mosques across East London. So they construct their Islamic identity through these fixed rituals, fixed ideas of how you ought to be as a Muslim, whereas they feel being a Bengali there is nothing fixed. Because our parents will mix and match and choose and pick and choose. So that was that was what people were saying that I interviewed. Islam they see as comfortable, and also there are no boundaries with Islam. By boundaries I mean it's not it's an ummah. There are no fixed nation states, no fixed borders. So we're all Muslims. We can marry anyone from a different background. Because I did talk about marriage to people, and they did say, well, that's the great thing about Islam, whereas Bengali, our parents would never accept it because they're so backward, they wouldn't allow us to marry someone of another background. So I think Islam provides that comfort and almost a fixed guideline of how to live your life, and obviously get success in the next life, as perceived by the people I interviewed. Comfort is my response. And then why are they willing to harm others? Well, I don't really look at, by harm others, do you mean terrorism or what do you mean?
Yeah, Islamic extremism. That
people
are going into Syria to fight from here.
Yeah. Again, with I don't look at extremism. I don't look at radicalization. Those aren't. I mean, there's a guy I can put you in touch with someone I know who's doing his PhD on this. But it's not related to the Bengali boys though, but just British Muslim boys. I don't look at this, so I won't be able to answer that question. Sorry.
Okay, I see a lot of hands going up, and we will get to everyone eventually. Maybe I'll take one from the back, the gentleman in the maroon jumper.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to create some controversy. I was born in West Bengal, in a Hindu family. At the moment, I'm a practicing atheist. Now, I started to question religion when I was about 12 or 13 and gave it up consciously about a age of 17 or 18. I think it is a religion is an obstacle, unnecessary division amongst people, but that's another subject. What I find a bit confusing in your presentation, that I think you're making a few oversimplified theories or other hypotheses. On one hand, you recognize that Bangladesh was not created as a Muslim identity, but East Pakistan was. Right? Now, I will come to that one later. I think Bangladesh was, as you correctly said, a secular place. And that's very important to understand. Now, on one hand, it's a secular place. On the other hand, your emphasis is on religion. Now, I'm not saying you are emphasizing it, but I'm saying the way you are looking at it, as if Bangladeshis are just nothing but Muslim. Now, that's oversimplified observation. To me, Bangladeshis are an ethnic group, but they're also nationalist group. The more important in their life is their language, and that's how we are created. Now, to understand a nation, you have three things to understand: ethnicity, culture, and socio-economic background. We didn't bother about socio-economic background at all. And it is important to understand how Bangladesh or how India was split. In my opinion, it was because of the casteism amongst the Hindus. The way I look at the whole thing, that India was partitioned, divided, because of the upper caste Hindu oppression. That's what made me going against Hinduism and later on about all religion, against it. But that has nothing to do with the present talk. What I'm saying is that you need to go into this aspect as to how Bangladesh was created. And then, when I look at my 99.9% of my friends in London are Bangladeshis. They're in their 30s and 40s and 50s. I'm an old man. Now, a few weddings I've attended, all the weddings I've attended, they all had Guy Holid. And nobody ever told me that that was only Hindu thing. I'm going to attend a wedding in Dhaka in January, and the very second day is Guy Holid, I was told. Now, these are not trivial things, they're very important things. What I'm saying is that if you try to analyze things only on the viewpoint of religion, you will get into wrong conclusions. This is the way I look at it. Now, the Bangladeshis, young Bangladeshis in East London, and the Bangladeshis I have met, and I'm going to meet in January, are two different categories. I've already noticed that. I think, my last point is, the reason the young Bangladeshis are becoming so religious, Islamic, it's nothing to do with Islam as a convenient thing, it's because of American imperialism. And that's the reaction to it. This is the way I do.
You talk about, I don't focus on Bangladeshis from Bangladesh. Yeah. My focus is on British Bangladeshis, which is confined to East London. Yeah. And my focus on religion, as I mentioned in the beginning, is because of the rise of Islam as an identity. Because that is used as it is a political identity, it can also be seen as an apolitical identity. But I look at Islam because of identity, the rise of identity politics, the rise of. I mean, you just have to flick through books of the history of Bengalis in East London to see the shift from the ethnicity to religion. These aren't new hypotheses I'm coming up with, nor are these new conclusions. And you mentioned socio-economic background. Actually, that is something I do look at. But I mentioned my two key focuses are ethnicity and religion, because I went in when I first gave my proposal to SOAS. I had a very broad proposal, but I had to narrow it down. And these are the two things I narrowed it down to, because these are the two things no one has looked at in relation to the Bangladeshi community. So when it comes to doing research, it's not just about personal interest, it's also to do with gap in literature. Otherwise, I'll just be reproducing things other people have already produced in libraries. So, with the point about Guy Holid, I did say I only interviewed 46 people, and it's those 46 people who didn't celebrate Guy Holid. So of course, that doesn't mean every Bengali doesn't celebrate Guy Holid, but these 46 people I interviewed, they certainly didn't and don't believe people should.
Great. I'll take a question from this side. Sorry, I just need to go. The guy holder thing, I think it might be to do with the generational gap you seem to have in your sample. And I'm quite intrigued as to why you've chosen up to 31 and then gone on to 45. I think I'm holder and I'm in that gap. And I think it would have been an interesting sample because that's sort of like the changeover generation who probably don't see things like the older ones and aren't as religious or don't have the politics of the younger generation. I just wondered why you missed that generation out.
Because I wanted to interview people who were because a lot of people I interviewed in their 40s had children who were my age, who were in their 20s. So I noticed that was the most common trend, that a lot of mothers were in their late 40s right now, and fathers are in their 50s who are 8-9 years older than them, whose husbands are 8-9 years older than them, but they had children who are my age. So I used that as a way to formulate my own sample. So I based it on that from the people I met. But of course, there's always room for interviewing those I missed out, the late 30s, early 50s. But that was based on the trend that I noticed, that the mothers who were in their mid-40s, late 40s, husbands in their mid-50s, late 50s had children who were in their 20s. And some were 30, 31. So that's why I stuck to those boundaries.
I think it's their own experiences that you would have got quite a lot of rich information, not about their children, but themselves and what they went through.
Yeah.
That generation.
Yeah, hence why it was oral history with the older generation, because they didn't have so much to say. But another point actually about, when you mentioned the whole Hindu thing, I've been trying to get hold of some Bengali Hindus here in East London. I got in touch with a few of them, and again, they didn't get back to me. So if you do know any, or if you yourself would like to be interviewed, I'd be more than happy to. Even if I've interviewed Bengali atheists. That's not because if you're an atheist, you're still a Bengali though. So that is what I'm interested in. But I interviewed a Christian, Bengali Christian from Dhaka, and he had an interesting view on ethnicity, on being a Bengali, and he never had a problem with his religion and his ethnicity until the Gulf War in the 90s. Now, when the Gulf War kicked in Dhaka, he was telling me how the church that he attended, he converted from Catholicism to Protestantism when he moved to Britain. And when he was in Dhaka, when the Gulf War kicked off, he arrived at his church to find Muslims who desecrated the whole church, and in fact they were praying in the field as a way to sort of anger the Christians. And that's when he became conscious of the fact that he's a Christian. He's different to those people who are praying in the field of the church. And he said that's what shaped his identity till today. That event of the Gulf War, which had nothing to do with him as a Bengali Christian in Dhaka, but a lot of the Muslims who did what they did to the church held him accountable and the Christian community because was it Saudi and Kuwait who allowed American bases in those two countries, and the Bengali Muslims felt that, well, these Christians amongst us must be supporting them, so they were attacked. So it's interesting to see how that was what how his entrance into religion came into existence, because prior to that he was a staunch Marxist. So that changed his whole perception. But he's the only non-Muslim I interviewed. Or non-Muslim. I have interviewed atheists who, one of them, in fact, his family are closely aligned to the Jamaat political party in Bangladesh. So he had a lot of interesting things to say about the trials and the conversations his family members have about the trials. And I also interviewed another atheist woman who left Islam because of a lot of mistreatment of women that she saw with the Bengali community made her leave Islam. Whereas with the guy that I interviewed, he left Islam because of science. It clashed with a lot of his scientific beliefs of how the world came about and how things work. But they're the only two atheists I interviewed. So I have been trying to get hold of Bengalis who are atheists, agnostics, but it's just because they're such a small minority, I have been struggling. So again, if anyone here does know Bengali Hindus, Bengali atheists, Buddhists, I'm more than happy to interview you.
Okay, I'll take your question.
So, is your research looking into like gender difference of British Bangladeshi young man and young woman, and how each are competing with one another? I think the younger generation of women are surpassing the younger generation of men in terms of education, and now that's causing what it did a few years ago, problems in marriage. So when it comes to marriage, the younger generation of Bengali women no longer see Bengali men as suitable partners because they don't apparently they're not educated on the same level. And I think that goes back to what you said earlier about parents not wanting their daughters to go into education and further education, but I think somehow it sort of backfired. I haven't looked at the stats yet, but this is what I'm seeing from observation, that women are now, Bengali women that don't see the Bengali man as equal, sort of good match for marriage.
Marriage was something I spoke about, but
so they move on to other guys and other girls.
Yeah.
Apparently that's not a match for them.
But I don't really look at gender, because gender, if I were to look at gender, that's a whole PhD in itself. Looking at gender, education, and
I think it's very important.
It is important, but when it comes to identity formulation, when it comes to the religious aspect, it seemed far more important than it did when it came to ethnic, the construction of the ethnic identity. But when I did speak about marriage, a lot of the girls felt that. I interviewed one woman. She was 30, and she got married when she was 16. She got married at the age of 16, and because her parents believed their daughters had to be married before they hit 18, because that's when they are free, they're adults, according to the British law. So all her sisters got married before they turned 18, and her parents told her she was marrying a doctor. But when she got married to him, she found out he's a waiter in a restaurant. It's something. She says she laughs at it now, but then when she got married and she found out he's not what he claimed to be and his family claimed to be, that was a pattern I found, that a lot of parents do that with their sons when they're not educated. So they put on this imagery of that my son is this, this, this. So he may work as in Marks and Spencer's as dealing with as a cashier, but parents would say he's an accountant or he's a finance analyst. So from her experience, from her sisters, she has 5 sisters, including her 6 of them, who all got married before the age of 18. They all had this experience of being told their husbands are something when they weren't. So I only interviewed her. I didn't interview her sisters, but she shared these stories with me. I interviewed her brother, and her brother is 25, still unmarried. So his parents are looking.
So is that maybe for high level divorce man?
Oh, divorce again.
I think your comment about girls doing better, that's true. In terms they're doing better, more success at GCSEs and A-levels and university. And I used to work in childhood education, and we looked into why this disparity. In Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, it's very similar. But in Key Stage 3, girls overtake boys. And that is to do with what you mentioned in your presentation, the policing that takes place within the family. Girls are more restricted in terms of mixing with the people outside home, the sort of wider society. So at the age of 12, 13, boys will have more freedom to go out and get involved with local boys and activities, but girls will stay in. This is double standard in our family. And I think this is what is turning them into education. So they're using their stay at home constructively and paying more attention to their studies and doing their homework. Whereas boys spending time in the housing estate, getting up to know.
Again, a lot of women get their freedom by using Islam as a way to find that freedom. So I can't remember the scholar's name who did a research on Bengali girls who wear the hijab here in East London. And he found from his interviews that girls who wear the hijab, their parents trust them more. So therefore they let them out and they don't have curfews. And even if they do have curfews, they tend to be much later than it would be for someone who didn't wear the hijab. So those were the conclusions in his research. But again, in education, the school I taught in last year, the girls were, compared to there were more boys in that school, but the girls still outdid, the Bengali girls outdid all the boys in their A-level results as well as their GCSE results. And it's astonishing, but more boys end up going to uni than the girls that went to that school.
Okay, it's 8 o'clock. We have about half an hour left. I still see a lot of hands going up. We know the parameters of Fatima's research, dress and language. Let's try and avoid some of the questions about education and things. They're really interesting, but maybe for afterwards when we're networking. Lady over there, please.
I am a youth and community worker in Shadwell. What role, if any, do you think non-Bengalis have in helping Bengali young people in particular? I'm talking about probably teenagers, so I know that's outside of your remit, but just as you see these differences with young people, what role do non-Bengalis have in helping Bengali teenagers navigate this sense of identity as British people, but albeit British Bengalis? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that question. It's not something that any of my participants brought up, nor did I walk in with that, because again, because of being an insider, I never had to consider what it feels like to be an outsider and research in the community. So, I mean, a few participants said to me in Bengali, because there were other people around, that if they were interviewed by someone non-Bengali, they wouldn't have opened up. So that's the only information I have as an insider. I won't be able to answer your question of what the role of an outsider who's not a Bengali would play in that role, because I interviewed a lot of youth. In fact, I interviewed people from the Montefort Centre. I interviewed people from one of the football organisations. No, I can't remember the name of the organisation, but I interviewed people from those youth organisations, and they were all Bengali. And by all Bengali, I mean those who attend the youth centre itself. So there was really no mention of non-Bengalis. Actually, Somalis were mentioned, the fact that there are more and more Somalis by Bengalis, but no mention of any other community. No.
It strikes me that my experience is living there as a neighbour and as a youth worker, that there is a real role actually for working together across communities of helping teenagers in particular navigate what it means to live here, to be British as well as Bengali, to be British Bengali. I don't know. And my experience is that my neighbours at least are very happy to tell me all about, particularly the older generation, tell me all about like their experiences of growing up in Bangladesh and even growing up here as a British Bengali. So I don't know, maybe there's scope for that. I'm sure people are doing
Great. Okay, lots of hands at the front. I take that question.
I was interested because you mentioned you're Bengali Christian from Dhaka, and I was wondering about how many Dhakaians compared to Sylhetis you've interviewed, and also thinking about regional or local identities, where the East End comes in your research, because is there a sense of being an East Ender rather than being a Muslim or a Bangladeshi? Is that part of identity for either generation?
There was the mention of being, because majority East Londoners are Biani Bazaris, North London Bengalis are Modi Bazaris. So that was brought up by a lot of people, this difference between being from whichever Bazar you're from. Yeah, there are differences, because a lot of people I interviewed, I've become friends with them. So some of them go and try to go and chill in Luton, and they mock Luton. So they're messaging me saying, oh, what's there? Where can we sort of hang out? So there's this idea that East London provides them with everything, because it's so. And in fact, a lot of people I've interviewed have never left this area. They only know this area. So they do refer to themselves as East Londoners. But the first part of your question, I interviewed, I can't give you numbers, I don't have numbers on me right now, but I interviewed 2 people from Noakhali. I interviewed a handful of Dakhayas, and the rest were all Sylhetis.
Do you think there's a difference in the way
there is, because the people that I interviewed were from Dhaka and the 2 Noakhalis, they were far more educated. A lot of them had, one of the Noakhali was a barrister, the other Noakhali up to Masters of Education, Ahmadullah Bhai, PhD level. A few other, I'm trying to recall the other Dhaka people. Master's level education. Yeah, master's level. So education level is definitely higher. But you hear that as a Sylheti anyway, that the Dhakas are always, they're different, out of Dhaka. So that was definitely their part of the conversation. But majority were without a doubt Sylheti.
But in terms of the religious, kind of the articulation of
religious. Well, actually, I forgot to mention Boishaki Mela.
Yeah.
So that was one of the questions I asked people about their ethnic identity, how they feel about the Boishaki Mela. And the Sylhetis just don't, they don't have an attachment to Boishaki Mela as much as those who are interviewed who are non-Sylheti. And also, some of the Sylhetis that I interviewed said that when it's Boishaki Mela on the streets of East London, it's usually those who are speaking Shuddha Bangla who are in the red and the white saris and with the bindis. It's very rarely you hear someone speaking Sylheti Bangla. So a lot of people did mention that during Boishaki Mela you see that cultural difference between those who are from Sylhet and those who are non-Sylheti, and those who celebrate and those who don't.
Yeah, because I think, you're distinct when you've been using the word Bengali and the word Bangladeshi, and I think it's something that every researcher into Bangladesh has that kind of methodological terminology issue. That, that if you're from Dhaka, you think of yourself as a Bengali and not and Sylhetis don't necessarily call themselves Bengali in Britain. But Bangladeshi, and there's that.
One of my questions is, do you call yourself Bengali or Bangladeshi? And a lot of people use the term British Bangladeshi, so they don't refer to themselves as British Bengali. And a lot of them say that is because they see no affiliation with West Bengal. So saying Bengali means you're a part of Greater Bengal, and saying Bangladeshi means you're confining yourself to the nation state of Bangladesh. So people were quite conscious of that, of the term Bangladeshi and then being Bengali. But I usually let people do the defining for me. So I asked the question, and I relied on them to define how they see themselves. So I know I use the term Bangladeshi and Bengali synonymously, and I think it's because of just habit. It's just my habit of doing that. But people, when I posed them the question, they definitely knew which one they were closer to and which one they used.
Another question from
okay, so you mentioned partition and discussion, and I just want to know what role that played in terms of identity, because you said the older generation had a huge part in terms of oral history, whereas the younger generation didn't. And do you think the lack of consciousness in the younger generation in terms of the role partition and independence played in formulating identity had an impact on what they said in terms of how they viewed themselves and how the older generation viewed themselves?
The older generation actually never discussed partition. Partition, as I mentioned, was something that I got as an idea from my second supervisor. My second supervisor, she's Pakistani, and she looks at British Pakistanis. And she said, as a researcher herself, when she's looked at British Pakistanis, she's found it interesting that partition focuses always on the Punjab. So she was the one who gave me the idea. But the people I interviewed, the older generation, that for them the story began with 71 or pre-71, and because the oldest person I interviewed was 58, 59. So none of them went as far back as partition. But they spoke passionately about, because they seemed very aware of the language movement that kicked off in 52. So people went as far as back the language movement, but sort of quickly jumped to 71. And a lot of them because they were in Britain while it was happening back home. So that was as far as they went back, the people I interviewed when it came to history.
Yeah, because you mentioned about the scapegoating in Hindus, and obviously partition had a huge role to play in terms of determining the way we sort of view Hindus and our differences. So I thought maybe there was a link between.
No, partition wasn't mentioned by anyone. No one. Everyone's focus was separate. And the younger generation, they don't care about Bangladesh politics. They didn't really mention much apart from their views on Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina and the tribals. But apart from that, they're not interested.
Can I quickly just ask? I'm an outsider, I'm not from the East End, but the East End, Tower Hamlets, is kind of labelled as the most kind of impoverished region in the South East, if not the whole of the UK. In your study, have you come across any kind of evidence to support that? And secondly, do you think that is a kind of real issue? I mean, I guess there's a general kind of consensus that there's so much impoverishment within the borough, the East End. So is there any kind of evidence on that? Have you come across anything as such, and why do you think that's the case?
For that, I guess I would have to look at a lot to do with the economy and socio-economic background. But again, there are plenty of studies on the socio-economic status of British Bangladeshis, especially in East London, in relation to social housing and benefits. So there are already studies out there that we can consult for that.
But I think my question really is, during your kind of interviews and your study, have you come across any kind of such evidence, to suggest?
Well, the one evidence I came across, almost everyone grew up in a council estate that I interviewed. Only recently have a lot of people who are moving out of this area who have just bought their first properties. So I guess that could be used as an indicator of. But this was something that one of my supervisors suggested, but I personally didn't feel comfortable discussing, because I know that as a Bengali, when I ask questions such as to do with economics, to do with money, it's a very sensitive, touchy area, especially as a woman as well. I thought, as an insider, that I should be careful when I discuss that. So that wasn't something I focused on, but people brought it up saying, actually, I grew up in a council estate, still live in that house. So it's people who brought in their stories of growing up in council properties, and a lot of people living in those 2-bedroom houses, 6-7 people in one house. But I never really delved into that.
Were you conducting the interviews in their homes?
A lot of people, yes. I interviewed them in their homes. Majority of the women I interviewed in their homes. None of the men or younger generation. They were usually Catholics and Muslims.
So I was just wondering if you looked into the role of technology, satellite TV, shaping identity. I know now what you have 20, 30 years ago, the proliferation of satellite TV channels, both based on race and language and also religion. And I know some families, lots of especially the younger generation, looking at these channels and forming ideas about their religious identity, what it means, and they're using these channels and the information they get from that, as well as the information from their local mosque, in order to establish what they feel about their religion and how religious they want to be and should be. So I wonder if that was
Sorry?
Is it something like Al Jazeera?
Yeah.
Well, Al Jazeera definitely plays a role in how Bengalis perceive Middle East politics. Al Jazeera was used as a reference for understanding Middle East politics. But when it came to technology, again, that's not something I looked at. My specific focus is just ethnicity, religion in relation to dress and language. But people brought up, just out of curiosity, how many of you know pure movements? No one? Okay, well, pure movements are these 4 or 5 Bengali boys who make videos on YouTube about cultural things that Bengalis do. And it's comedy, and it's hilarious. So one guy I interviewed mentioned those videos, and he finds it amazing and nice to see guys in their 20s who are creating these videos and talking about the stereotypes that exist in the Bengali community. And then there's the other guy called Ali Official. Everyone heard of Ali Official?
Yes.
He's even got his own show now. So again, the same guy mentioned Ali Official and how he makes these videos about Bengali stereotypes, especially Sylheti families. They're very specific to Sylheti families. So people mentioned the two of them and how they use Instagram and YouTube as a way to connect to younger Bangladeshis. I tried to get hold of Ali Official. I did email him, but he got the job in Warner Brothers, so he didn't have time. But
Is he in East London?
he's from Tipton.
Okay.
So where is that, Tipton? Tipton?
West Yorkshire.
Okay, well that's where he's from. I don't know where that is. So I think he's from the Tipton area. Or maybe I'm making that up. No, I don't think he's from Tipton. I'm just trying to remember where he's from because he said he's not from Bristol. Is he from Bristol?
I think so, yeah.
Bristol? Okay, so one of the B's or B's. So people mentioned those two, Ali Official Pure Movements, and someone mentioned how in the 90s, while the Bhangra music was kicking off in the Punjabi community, a lot of remixing of Baul songs were kicking off apparently here in East London. That a lot of Bengali boys, even now apparently in East London, they play Baul music that are remixed with a Bollywood song or by Tupac rapping in the middle of the Baul song. So someone did mention that. But again, music would be a whole field in itself, and I believe you have one topic here on cinema, and I believe music as well. So yeah, I don't really go into that, but that was mentioned just by one person. Those videos.
Okay. I just wanted to go on one of that, instead of the religious channels, what about the Whitechapel, /LS, 18 Bangla as well. I think a lot of those, what would you consider about that in terms of cultural shift or the return to culture? And similar to the Whitechapel that you mentioned, I know you said there's a lot of people that are there from Dhaka, but I think there's such a big turnout, it's not actually exclusive to that community. There's a lot of Bengali people from East London and other parts of London that actually come to this event, which is annual. And then other sort of cultural things which take place in schools. A lot of families are returning back to culture. Do you consider that, and where do you see a sort of return to culture? Is there any sort of shift, do you think?
Again, I rely heavily on what participants share with me to be able to analyse that, and that wasn't brought up by young people, this idea of return to culture. So there were two guys that I can think of at the top of my head that I interviewed. One is 25, the other one's 24. They believe that their group of friends will be returning back to culture. They're going to lead this mini revolution in Islam because they really are concerned that they are policed by some of their male friends who become more religious. So these are boys who are telling me how they are being policed because of their lack of beard or too stylish of a beard. So yeah, those are the two I can think of who spoke of this idea of return to culture, of their mothers wearing saris. One of them, his mum, she's a doctor at the NHS, and she goes to work in a sari, and he proudly mentioned that in the interview. So yeah, I'd say those are the only two I can think of right now, but I tend to rely on my participants to bring up topics rather than me imposing it. So those are the only two I can think of that brought up the return of culture.
Do you not ask questions about what they identify as being cultural, and do they actually participate in those traditions?
Yeah, but TV channels weren't mentioned in relation to that. So they mentioned things like eating of hutki as a way of... so hutki was the most common thing, or
dried fish.
Is dried fish.
It's a Marmite something.
Or things such as banta in Bengali. I did a focus group at LSE with 7 Bengali boys. No female turned up. It was 7 boys that I interviewed, and the 7 of them mentioned food, mentioned Bengali banter. This joking element of that you get with Bengali, you can't do in English. So that was one thing they mentioned. And cultural, what else? So food and banter seemed to be, but banter was mainly with the boys that I interviewed, not the women. So maybe because of the way they talk and words they use, the boys are not the girls. I don't know. That is something I'd have to because I'm still analysing the data. I'm still transcribing all my interviews as we're speaking actually. I just and I've got to transcribe it all and take it from there.
We've got just a little over 5 minutes left. Who's got a really burning question? I'll take your question.
I'm not Bengali, so this is an outsider's point of view. I'm really interested in the gap between generations and how the older generation sees the younger generation and vice versa. My impression is, I guess, as an outsider, is that the older generation has a nostalgia and a sadness for what's been lost, and the younger generation seems to have an impatience and the impatience and the ability to move on. Do you have an understanding of how these different generations see each other, and whether there's any hope for that boundary and that barrier to be taken down or bridged in some way?
The first issue that was brought up was communication. The younger generation I interviewed, they don't speak fluent enough Bengali to really articulate themselves to their parents. They speak very little English. So language is a key barrier here, because a lot of the children, or not children, but the younger generation, they only speak Bengali at home. And it's very limited to just sort of home vocabulary, so they're not really fluent, so to say. So the language is a key issue between the two generations. And to a certain extent, understanding of religion as well. Because I interviewed I remember one woman I interviewed who works in a mosque here in East London. She mentioned how, from her experience, women that come to, she's based in the Marian sector, and she told me that women who go there, they are actually trying to practice more and more of their civility by joining the gym in the Marian Center, which they opened recently, and activities, as a way to try and reconnect with their mothers, especially because they feel they can't express their emotions, they can't tell them things. But then there's also the cultural element people mentioned of you're not supposed to have these emotional conversations with your family members, with your fathers, with your mothers. So that was also there. So language, the key thing, and then the cultural idea that you're not supposed to sit with your father or mother and have these emotional conversations with them.
What were the parents saying in this point?
The older generation that I interviewed, that one gentleman I interviewed, he's involved in a project here in East London where he encourages parents to come with their children. So teenage children, they come to him and they try to do this thing of having like this triangular conversation where he acts as a mediator. So that's his job, where he brings Bengali parents, especially those who speak very little English, and he tries to fill that gap of what the 15, 16-year-old is trying to say to the mother or father. So he's active in this. And in fact, I did ask him if I could come and observe such a situation, but because of ethical reasons, he didn't allow it, because it would have been seen as sort of me invading the space of the parent and the child. But it would have been fascinating to see how he does it, and how he speaks to the child, for the child to open up to the mother. The people that I interviewed, they all spoke English. But I didn't really they didn't really bring up their children or family. And again, perhaps if I were an outsider, I could have maybe asked more questions and probed more about their family. But I felt, because as an insider, with family, again, it's a bit of a sensitive area to go into. So again, I had my own boundaries of being an insider that I had to be careful of which lines I can cross and which lines I couldn't. So.
Did you ever interview families? So like
families,
mother or daughter?
No, I interviewed the 30-year-old woman who got married at the age of 16. I interviewed her while her two daughters were present. So her 14-year-old daughter and her 11-year-old daughter were there. And they participated in the conversation. They thought it was amazing that their mother got married at the age of 16, and so she was having this very open conversation with me about her relationship with her husband while her daughters were there. So that was the only conversation I had with a mother who had her daughters there. And in fact, I even asked her, I said, do you want your daughters there? Because I have a few questions that you might not feel comfortable your daughters knowing about if you want to discuss it further. And she said, no, I want them here. So they stayed in that room and they listened. but that's the only family arrangement.
Okay, I think one last question and then we should wrap up. Yes.
I just want to ask, I know most of your, like, the people that you interviewed are from East Ham. I think you said you were concentrating in this community. But I thought maybe, like, from yourself, or if you have any hypotheses of people that grew outside of the Bengali community, how they identified, because, like, just listening to your lecture, I was just thinking back when we were in university, we tried to start up a society, and most of the interests were actually from people who didn't, like, come from Bengali communities themselves, like I didn't and Raz didn't. And actually what we found was, this is just from personal experience, I'm not like generalizing, but the people that were actually at uni that actually were Bengalis from East London, they didn't show any interest at all. They didn't really want to try and meet the other Bengalis at universities. But all the Bengalis, like the ones that grew up in East London and the ones that didn't, all actually did have an interest for ISOC, whereas like Bangladesh had more interest in Islamic sorry. But there was like the East Londoner Bangladeshis all had an interest for ISOC, but no interest for like going to Bangladesh, meeting other Bangladeshis or history. Whereas I found the ones that didn't grow up in the community actually showed more interest and wanted to contribute. So it was actually interesting. Like I didn't actually think of that until this lecture, and it might just be a coincidence. But I thought, like, is there a difference in identity from?
Most likely. I mean, I come from Luton, and there the Bengali community is a very small community, and everyone literally knows everyone. Although this is the case in East London, but it's just a much bigger community, so there's a slight chance you're not known. Whereas in Luton, again, these are just from personal, from growing up there my whole life. It's a much smaller community, and I know people from our own family and other people's families who travel to East London as a day out because of the Bengali community and the shops. And
but is religion still such a major presence in identity rather than language and other Bengali?
Well, in Luton we have 3 main mosques that are Bengali, but it depends on which political parties they're affiliated with that people will attend. But I don't think that's any different to East London.
Okay.
So religion-wise, just from personal observation in Luton, I'm not sure if it's any different, but I guess it is influenced by which party your family support in Bangladesh, just as it is here, because I interviewed people whose family members are heavily involved with Jamaat. I interviewed one guy who's very involved with Brick Lane Mosque, and had nothing positive to say about East London Mosque. So I guess it varies on your family, their politics, who they support. But if you mean sort of aesthetically, do I see a difference? I definitely see more women in the niqab in East London. But maybe that's because there are more Bengali women here than there are in Luton. So these are just personal observations.
There's a number of mosques in town, so I don't know what the situation is now, but at one time, and still is probably, more mosques than youth clubs. There is a mosque in every housing estate now, more or less. 50 or so mosques in town is alone. And mosques are very central to the community life in those neighborhoods. You know, they're used 5 times a day for prayers, children go there for their Arabic lessons, parents go there for old people's groups, mothers groups, all sorts of activity. So mosque plays a very important cultural role.
Yeah, and a lot of people that I interviewed who went to, who have children who are in their teens, they go to the fora, the Islamic teaching in mosques. But the old generation mentioned how about 20 years ago it was in people's houses. Yeah. So you would, someone would recommend a local imam or mesab, and you'd say, oh, this mesab teaches between this time, so they would go based on the recommendation. Whereas now people choose. So I interviewed 2 families, or not families, but 2 fathers who send their children to Ibrahim College. And they spoke very highly of Ibrahim College, that, you know, this is our Zaytuna here in Britain, the equivalent of the Islamic College in San Francisco, led by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. So a lot of people took pride in the fact that, you know, and the Sheikh is also Bengali. So these 2 fathers took a lot of pride in the fact that it's one of our local boys who's a Sheikh, who's come back. and he's spreading his knowledge. So yeah, mosque is definitely where everything takes place, but there is no Bengali anymore. Whereas about 20-25 years ago, the children who were sent for Fora for the Islamic teaching, they also got Bengali classes in that same lesson. Whereas now it's just recitation and tajweed, no Bengali whatsoever.
It's a shame. It's a shame.
Okay, there will be more opportunity in the networking session. I think we're now in here and around almost just before 9. Before we wrap up, Alhamdulillah, did you have any questions?
No question, I just want to make some
Okay. Thank you everyone for your questions, but thank you especially to Fatima for what I thought was a really fascinating talk. When I spoke to her on the phone last week, actually there's a lot in her study that hasn't come out in tonight's talk, and that's how rich it is. Like her interviews are so rich, her data is so rich. So please do stay behind and talk to her, because there's some fascinating things, and I think it could grow arms and legs, and I think there's more room for study here. So it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Lastly, if you're not familiar with the Brick Lane Circle, Ahmadullah, he does some great work in terms of heritage projects. He mentioned the Battle of Plassey. They also did a great project last year where you recreated Muslim dresses, and maybe you'll talk a bit more about that. So on the one hand, the heritage, kind of retaining some sort of heritage links to Bengal, but also sort of getting to know one another. And in fact, that's the name of one of his projects, which again, he might tell you more about. It's about this community. He has funding from the Heritage National.
Not now, we did.
You did, okay, yeah, okay. And it's all about social cohesion and things. So he's very much involved in all these other projects, in addition to this Bengal History Week every year, and just his ordinary seminar series which he runs. So do look out for them. They're fascinating, some great research that gets presented. And if you've got research that you'd like to present for yourself, do bring it forward.
Yeah, we welcome.